Good morning and most welcome to 1341 of the Heidegger series. And today I will take up two books by Stephen M. Rosen. One will concern the famous Michelson-Morley experiment of 1887, and there will be a quote included from Alfred North Whitehead. The first book by Stephen M. Rosen is Dimensions of Apeiron. Highly recommended, lucidly written, very clear exposure of topology and what dimensions are. The second book is, if you can hand me the second book. Second book is Self-Evolving Cosmos, also by Stephen M. Rosen, with a subtitle, A Phenomenological Approach to Nature's Unity in Diversity. And the last book is Alfred North White's biography by Victor Lowe, Alfred North Whitehead, the man and his work. And of course I had to add that Alfred North Whitehead is one of the favorite philosophers of the famed Ian McGilchrist. So I will start at page 18 in Dimensions of Apeiron. It's the second paragraph, and it concerns the Michelson-Morley experiment of 1887. The failure of Galilean relativity was indeed baffling to the classical eye. It is not an obvious fact of perception that if I change my perspective on an object, I am viewing, its appearance will change accordingly. What the Michelson-Morley experiment demonstrated in its abstract way was that when the object being considered is light, the familiar principle of experience does not apply. It would certainly look strange to me if I got up from this computer screen I am sitting at, moved all the way to the right of it, so that I was viewing the screen at an acute angle. but found that the screen had the same full square appearance as when I was sitting directly in front of me. Analogously, this is what Michelson and Morley saw when they looked at light from different angles. Reference frames. This strange outcome was most alarming to physicists. It came as a bombshell that was soon to precipitate a revolution in physics. That is the Einsteinian revolution. That is because the finding of Michelson and Morley did nothing less than call into question the classical intuition of object in space before subject that had implicitly governed human experience for many centuries. We know that the maintenance of classical identity is essentially predicated on separating subject and object in such a way that whereas objects changed concretely, the subject and the space in which it operates remain abstractly the same. The concrete change I expect to see when I shift my position with respect to the computer screen. Presupposes that the spatial context within which I make this observation itself does not change. That its continuity is preserved. By the same token, the presupposition is that I do not change. That the invisible I behind these eyes remains indivisible. Retains its individuality. It is because a solitary individual lies behind the multiplicity of concretely shifting perspectives that sad perspectives are readily interchangeable. With one being continuously transformable into another predictable fashion. Confirmation of these predictions serves to confirm the cogitus sense of himself. When, upon altering my perspective, I see how the appearance of an object that I have been viewing changes as expected. I am indeed reassured that I have not changed. This is in a nutshell the crux. My assumption that the observer, the subject, is the same. What Michelson and Morley saw was not reassuring. To appreciate just how deeply troubling the Michelson-Morley experiment was, let us digress briefly to return to the root of the problem. Cultural theorists Elizabeth Gross, 1994, examines the original condition for the emergence of individuality. For a subject to take up a position as a subject, it must be able to be situated in the space occupied by its body. This anchoring of subjectivity in its body is the condition of coherent identity, and moreover the condition under which the subject has a perspective on the world and becomes a source for vision. A point from which vision emanates and to which light is focused. I think it could be very apt here to compare with Brunelleschi's central perspective. All light going to one singular position, that of the observer, or if you prefer, origo, or the vanishing point, as it's called in painting. The emergent subject is the focal point organizing space. The representation of space is a correlate of one's ability to locate oneself as the point of reference of space. The space represented is a complement of the kind of subject who occupies it. Fully developed, the space in question is the perspectival space that has dominated perception at least since the Renaissance. It is the continuum. In some, a stabilized body image. a consistent and abiding sense of self and bodily boundaries. Requires and entails understanding one's position vis-à-vis others. One's place at the apex or organizing point in the perception of space. So our earliest, most basic sense of ourselves as stable, autonomous individuals is inseparably linked to our experience with space. The idealized Cartesian subject might fancy itself a disembodied spirit that is freely transcendent of space. But the underlying reality is that however high this subject may appear to fly, it remains tethered to its ground. The classical subject's relation to space necessarily is maintained, as the old formula implies. Object in space before subject. Rose's analysis of Sigmund Freud and Jacques Lacan demonstrates the close parallel between the development of subjectivity in the history of human culture. On the one hand, and the early development of an individual child on the other. Freud's 1914 concept of primary narcissism implies that there is a primary constancy grounding all others. The image of one's body. Which constitutes the earliest manifestation of the ego. Because one's imagined body serves as the frame of reference from which all observations are made. An object seen to change with changes in perspective can be taken as the same object only insofar as the observer's body is implicitly sensed as remaining the same. Object constancy thus depends on subject constancy. or in Freudian terms, on the constancy of the ego. In Lacan's 1953 elaboration on Freud, the mirror stage is crucial to the initial appearance of an invariant body image. The child begins to develop a stable sense of its identity. To form an image of its own body as a whole. When the mother's body can be mirrored back to it as its primary object or alter ego. This possibility arises at around 6 months of age, and depends in turn on the psychological separation of the infantile body from that of the mother. Gross 1994, in drawing on Lacan, thus observes that it is in this mirror stage that the division between subject and object even the subject's capacity to take itself as an object becomes possible for the first time. And of course, this is the stage in which space first appears. So a little note here, there cannot be any space before that. Very important. It is through space that the confirmation of one's basal identity is mirrored back to one. In encountering expected variations in the appearance of the mother's face with changes in perspective upon her. The emergent individual is reassured that he is indeed one origo. It is this primary reassurance that anchors human identity. And eventually makes possible the quest for unity in science. So it's quite massive stuff. I would say nothing could be more radical. We have already, by infantile stage, developed an origo, and thereby space becomes. And to see how this can affect a person, let me take a reading from the biography of R. Alfred North Whitehead. Handed to me by my dear colleague Kalle Lundahl. And the effect on Whitehead was, to say the least, enormous. Listen out. This is from page 187, the last paragraph. An Anglican who asks himself with the utmost sincerity whether he should go to Rome is assuming that authority is essential for religion. And is seeking that authority. When Whitehead first asked himself this question, the authority of Newtonian concepts in physics was absolute. As the 1890s advanced, it became clouded. every year brought new discoveries, and the Newtonian framework became more and more strained. New ideas were needed to explain radioactivity, and Fitzgerald suggested that if matter was electrical in nature, a body moving through the electromagnetic ether might contract in a way that would explain the negative result of the Michelson-Morley experiment of 1887. By 1897, it appeared that Newtonian physics was not at all secure. Whitehead later called this crumbling of the scientific rock one of the crucial experiences of his life. It cannot have strengthened his assumption that there was a true traditional authority in religion, however hard to identify. I suppose that this was one cause of the decision he had reached in 1897 or 98. His decision was not to go to Rome, but as he had put in that meeting of the apostles 11 years before, in the other direction. he now could find no clear authority in either Rome or Canterbury. No system of dogma that satisfied him. No system of dogmas that satisfied him, and no compelling reason for subscribing to any promulgated articles of Christian faith. He had come to ask himself, more and more frequently, how can they be so sure? The upshot was that Whitehead became an agnostic. It is a reasonable speculation that almost from the beginning of his private debate, he was wondering how he ought to think of God and immortality. If he went to Rome, the answer in essentials would be given to him. I do not think he liked that in any area of inquiry. Of course, I am reading back from what I know of the mature cast of his mind. The effect on him at this time of the disintegration of the Newtonian system that he had given to his undergraduate pupils supports the reading back. Also, I suppose that he could not entirely stop his wandering about God and immortality, even as he contemplated joining the Roman Catholic Church. Perhaps he saw that an undercurrent of wandering would continue after taking that step. In 1887, it changed the origo, the ego, and the body in the most dramatic possible way. The conception, the experience of a stable point of origin had been with humanity for millennia. It is the founding, unspoken ground of all Western thinking. No matter if it's science, philosophy, religion, and the arts. The central perspective is still with us, as so aptly proven by many research programs in perception. I perceive myself as an originator of what happens or exists around me. And I will have to add, that goes for time as well. My position is absolutely dependent on that there is an originating observation, unspoken, unmentioned, but always present. It's a very good example, the quote from the biography, of how this could shatter a human being's most foundational thinking, that of God and mortality. This is, for me, not the first time I experienced this. I had vivid discussions 10, 15 years ago with an engineer who was absolutely shocked by the idea of a not unchanging origin, that there was no origo to make everything fixed, stable, and I would say for that civil engineer and many others, my thinking is the absolute majority of the population Morrison Morley, the MM of 1887, is the first huge step to what would later become quantum physics. We'll see if there are any questions possible.
Thank you. Rosen, Stephen Rosen, he uses the computer screen as an example.
Rosen.
Thank you. Rosen. Stephen Rosen uses the computer screen as an example. But let's say we, as the early quantum physicists, they use the human being as a starting point, like the observer. How would the light, so the computer screen, if we look at the computer screen from different viewpoints, it's always the same, that is, it's immobile in one sense, or we apply to you, light comes to you from all the sides, but you remain the same. Or what is the what is that this experiment really teaches us?
I would say this is incredibly hard to imagine. Incredibly hard. It is a tough nut to crack. But when we move around in the world, and if I can borrow your computer screen, just let it be like that. Please, I take it. I'll see here.
Yes, sir.
Move it very slowly, and then you go to the right, and slowly. As you can see, the computer screen changes. It's starting to look different. Why is that? It is because you are moving. You are the originator. You are your body, your perception. In a way, that is where the world starts. And it's also the birth of space. See? There is no top. There is space going on here that previously did not exist. So you see there is a change, and this is the genesis of space itself. What Michelson-Morley proved, and I'm afraid has not been disapproved since, is that it does not change. It remains the same no matter where you are at, no matter where your body is situated. The screen does not change. And this, I see my colleague trying to understand, cannot be understood. We just have to accept it. I don't think any one of you have any problem to understand how utterly absurd, outrageous this is, and what it can do to our conception of ourselves, of our world, because it changes also the world. Remember the computer screen. That's the things that build up the world. So it's not only important for the conception of me having a body, being a person, having an ego, to the island, having an ego, being someone, everything that is connected with my individuality is within the idea of a stable observance. So put a little pause there, I can take that up. I will now read another take on it from another book by Stephen M. Rosen, The Self-Evolving Cosmos, which I mentioned initially. It concerns the same problem, but it's put in other terms, which is, I would say, very helpful for the understanding of this forbiddingly difficult thing. This is from the second paragraph of page 66. My critique of string theory's abstractness and of the abstractness of modern physics in general reflects a key issue in the foundations of mathematical physics. That of formalism versus intuitionism. Intuitionism is rooted in the thinking of Descartes. By intuition, says Descartes, a quote. I mean not the wavering assurance of the senses, or the deceitful judgment of a misconstructing imagination, but a conception formed by unclouded mental attention. So easy and distinct as to leave no room for doubt in regard to the thing we are understanding. It comes to the same thing if we say it is an indubitable conception formed by an unclouded mind. One that originates solely from the light of reason, and is more certain even than deduction, because it is simpler. Thus anybody can see by mental intuition that he himself exists, that he thinks that a triangle is bounded by just 3 lines, and a globe by a single surface, and so on. End of quote. This mode of insight was carried forward by Kant in his a priori certitude about space and time as the immutable organizing principle for all experience. And early in the 20th century, it was further advanced by certain neo-Kantian mathematical intuitionists. We saw earlier, however, that the classical intuition of space and time already had been opened to serious doubt before the 20th century began. As a consequence of this, it was the formalist approach to mathematical physics that came to prominence. And has been dominant ever since. Here, mathematical abstraction is employed in an effort to fill the vacuum left by the collapse of classical intuition. So you see here, intuition itself, I would say, our thinking process was compromised in 1887. Beginning with Einstein's introduction of the counterintuitive notion of four-dimensional space-time. Which responded to the failure of classical space implicit in the Michelson-Morley experiment. Physics has heaped abstraction upon abstraction. becoming more and more detached from the reality of everyday experience. In the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics, for example, no bones are made about the fact that it's Hilbert space. Is but a mathematical fiction devised to yield pragmatic results. In the absence of an ability to represent the microphysical domain in an intuitively grounded, realistic manner. And while opponents of the Copenhagen view have argued for a realistic construal of the quantum domain, the reality most described arises as a mere artifact of the formalism. This is true of what physicist Henry Stapp calls the absolute psi interpretation. Psi refers here to the basic mathematical wave function of quantum mechanics, described by a vector in Hilbert space. In the absolute psi interpretation, which includes the view that the psi wave collapses upon observation, and the alternative many worlds view that it does not. The mathematical wave function is seen as a veridical representation of the underlying quantum reality. But I would ask whether a reality of this kind being naught by a byproduct of the formalism devised by the analyst can be regarded as anything more than nominally real. It is in essentially the same sense that string theory's Kaluza-Klein account of unification is realistic. I suggest that the subsymmetries of Kaluza-Klein do not reflect concrete reality as much as the need to uphold abstract continuity. Although most physicists have been willing to ignore the limitations of such a formalistic approach, the minority group seeking a form of quantum mechanical realism that is more than merely nominal remains sensitive to the problem. And this is extremely important. Thank you, Rosen. However, this does not mean that formalism should be abandoned in favor of traditional realism or intuitionism. I cannot enough emphasize the importance of that thing. It is a bit like we are stranded between two deadly sins, and by rejecting formalism we end up in the gap of intuitionism. This should be avoided. We must refrain from constructing a conception or an understanding. The mere renunciation of formalism in advocacy of classical intuition cannot address the problem of unification. I submit that the basic difficulty with the abstractionist approach to unification lies not in its questioning of classical intuition, but in its failure to question it deeply enough. Though contemporary string theory implies that unification indeed cannot be achieved if we restrict ourselves to the Kantian intuition of space and time. Instead of raising genuine doubt about that intuition by opening continuity itself to question, which would in fact call into question the classical formula of object in space before subject. We have seen that string theory maintains the continuity abstraction in a higher order form. Thus, both the need to question classical intuition and the intention of upholding it are implicitly expressed. By indicating that the old intuition of space and time should not be taken a priori at all. That it actually resulted from a concrete cosmogonic process. The question is raised by at once assuming that the continuous space and time of immediate experience are but topological manifestations in a more abstract order of changeless continuity. The question is cancelled. Having obtained an idea of the price the abstractionist pays for cancelling his own question before it earnestly can be asked, we may ponder an alternative. Suppose the question is not cancelled. Suppose a genuine concretization of mathematical physics is entertained. Instead of sidestepping the loss of Kantian symmetry, of epistemological continuity, by rendering the 3+1 dimensional continuum suppose we hold our ground at the first level of abstraction and allow the classical intuition of space and time to be challenged. Could mathematical physics which has always given primacy to invariance or symmetry, survive such a development? So also from Rosen's second book in today's reading is taking up from a wholly different perspective the problems with problems erupting from the discovery of 1887. And the very important warning, there is a Swedish word which I should use here, is called a brasklapp. And that means do not side, because the formalism is known to be incorrect. That could push us into traditional realism or intuitionism, where it all once upon a time started. Both are most definitely under question. But that doesn't mean you choose. And this could be the hardest part of this strong medicine, to make a metaphor. It is enormously hard to accept a conceptualless universe and a non-conceptualized me or ego at the very same time. But that is definitely the recommendation coming from physics itself. And I just see what the project of helping people to question their intuitions could erupt to and how it could be formulated. But I think it needs to be done. Otherwise, you will still be there. And this is why the revolution of 1887 is still under the cover, because the alternative, accepting formalism, is wrong in all senses but the formal. One concluding question, maybe? Give the microphone to my dear colleague.
Thank you. Physicists and people talk much about relativity, that everything is relative and so forth, but we have learned that one thing is not relative, namely light. That's important to remember. Light is not relative. And I think Rosen takes up this thing very clearly when I read in this book Apeiron from page 20, that you read also. He quotes Mendel Sachs, who is a physicist. Mendel Sachs said that what is it that propagates from an emitter of light, such as the sun, to an absorber of light, such as one's eye? Is it truly a thing on its own? Or is it a manifestation of the coupling of an emitter to an absorber? End quotation from Mendel Sachs. Rosen's conclusion is that there is a blending of subject and object, and he makes a very clever homonym that you observed in a past lecture this summer. The homonym is between I, that is I, you, I as a pronoun, and I as a noun, that is the I that we see here. And it's a very clever, this homonym is great. I as your I, stands for light, of course. And I as a pronoun stands for the subject. And you cannot separate these two things. And do you want to say something?
No, it's very good. It's very good. And I am not sure if I want to complicate things even more. But of course, the constant speed of light puts also into question origin and destination. Since the speed of light is constant, it's very hard to talk about an origin of the light. That is part of the formalism that we work with, but not try to conceptualize or hold for an absolute truth. Thank you very much for your patience and have a beautiful morning. Bye bye for now.